recording, and you should now be able to see the textbook page of the League of Nations. Remember, I can't see the chat bar, so if you've got an issue, then just unmute yourselves and please say so. So, the League of Nations, one of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Remember, he had a 14-point plan to keep world peace. And the League of Nations was something that was included in the Treaty of Versailles, which is a great thing. You've got to celebrate that, okay? Because this is going to help to keep the world safer, or at least we hoped it would. Okay. Now, why was the League created? I've just mentioned it was created to keep the world safer. It was based in Switzerland, Geneva, but it wasn't just aimed at keeping the world safer from avoiding war. It was aimed at making the world a better place. It had, part of it was an organization to tackle infectious diseases. They had a slavery commission. They had a commission that focused on employment, working conditions for the whole world. So it wasn't just aimed at stopping wars. It was something aimed at making the world a better place. And that's why Woodrow Wilson wanted to include it. Just wanted to draw your attention to the purple box on the right-hand side here. The League had a covenant. It's a key word here. And this outlined how the League was going to deal with aggression. And it was a 3-step process. We're going to look at the setup of the League of Nations in a minute, but we should know it did not have an army. So it wasn't a case of if a country is acting aggressively, just send in the army and beat them to a pulp to make them follow what the League wants, okay? It was much more of a diplomatic process. And the first method to stop aggression was mitigation, getting the two countries to sit down together and talk through their problems. Unfortunately, it's not going to be that effective, I don't think. The next method that the League could use is moral condemnation, a good telling off. Now, once again, just like mitigation, this was easy to ignore. But it was hoped that if the whole world joins in telling you off, and I say the whole world, to begin with, there were 42 different countries involved in the League of Nations, not Germany or the USSR, but 42 other nations. And the hope was, if they all gang up on you and tell you off, wag a finger at you and say, hey, look, what you're doing is wrong, that might be enough to force you to reconsider your actions. But again, it's very easy just to ignore moral condemnation. And we see that with Japan and Italy. When Italy invades Abyssinia and Japan Manchuria, the League morally condemns both of them. And it was very easy to say, we don't care. That's exactly what they did. And then lastly, and this is probably the most powerful weapon that the League had, was economic sanctions. This is where the League would act as one, again, 42 different nations, all ganging up on said country and saying, we're not going to trade with you anymore. That's a big deal, okay, because countries rely upon world trade, not just one trading partner, quite often lots of different trading partners. And if they start saying to you, well, we're not going to trade with you anymore, you're going to lose money. Okay, money that can be invested in hospitals and schools, into people's lives, society. If people become impoverished and angry, they're not going to vote for you again, are they? So economic sanctions could force countries into behaving themselves, or at least just changing their course of action. Now, this was only effective if the League all worked together. And just above it, just here, have I got a highlighter? Let's try to highlight a bit. There it is, highlighter. Collective security. Key word. Okay, collective security. That's the only way moral condemnation or economic sanctions could work. Okay, so we're going to now have a look at how the League was set up. And in my opinion, this is one of the reasons why the League failed in the 1930s and in the 1920s. Its structure made it very difficult for the League to be successful. You could almost argue that the League failed or was set up to fail from the very beginning. So let's have a quick look at that structure now. Let's hide this, zoom in a little bit. There we go. So the first branch of the League of Nations that we're going to look at is the Assembly. And the Assembly is probably the most powerful branch of the League of Nations. But, there's a big but, okay? It only met once a year. So what can we say? It's like an international parliament, but it only met once a year. Realistically, is it going to be able to solve countries' problems if they're only ever meeting once a year? I would say no. And that's one of the reasons it was set up to fail. Not on purpose. People just didn't give it the respect that it needed, didn't give it the time that it needed. And the Assembly definitely needed to meet more than once a year. On top of that, for them to decide upon a course of action, the vote had to be unanimous. So if Germany had been misbehaving and us as members of the League of Nations all have a vote on punishing Germany, but one of us disagrees, then that course of action cannot be followed through. And that's significant. Trying to get 42 countries to all vote the same way is a challenge. People have different opinions about what should be done to different countries. Okay? So the Assembly, I would argue, was an element of the League that caused it to fail. It's worth pointing out that it was the most powerful of all of the bodies within the League. It could decide when a new country could join. It decided upon the judges for the Court of Justice. And it also decided how the League's money was to be spent. You don't need to write all of this down. This textbook is online for you, Caboodle Code PX7, so you can look at this at a later date. This is recorded as well, so you can go onto YouTube when it gets posted there and follow it. Again, you can watch it 3 or 4 times if need be. So the Assembly, the most important part of the League, but definitely one of the cogs that caused the League to crack and fail. So let's move down now to the Council. The Council was formed in response to the Assembly only meeting once a year. And it says there, an Assembly of 42 countries, which meant once a year, would not ensure the League ran smoothly. And as a result, the Council was set up to meet more frequently. There were 8 members of the Council, 4 permanent members, and 4 members elected for 3 years. My apologies. Now, unfortunately for the League, the permanent members of the Council always had a say. Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, 4 of the most powerful nations on the planet at that time after World War I, okay, and they became the permanent members of the Council. Now, this ensures that they always had a say. What makes that more significant is the Council had the power to veto anything that the Assembly had managed to agree upon. So if by some miracle the Assembly had agreed upon a course of action, but it didn't suit France, France could veto it, which means it would not happen. Now, countries behaved very selfishly during this interwar period. Countries were suffering, so they struggled to think about world affairs over their own problems, which means countries did act selfishly. That veto was used, which prevented courses of action that actually might have been very good for the world. And Britain, France, Japan, and Italy all had the power to abuse that system, which isn't fair, which again makes the League's job extra difficult. One of the reasons why it failed. Another reason why the League failed is the Court of Justice. Now, hopefully you can remember that this Court of Justice was a brilliant thing. 2 countries arguing, now they can meet before 11 different judges, and I'm saying 11, I hope it says 11 now. Oh, it does, yeah, 11 judges. and 4 deputies, so they could bring their problems before the judges. The judges would sit there, they'd listen to the evidence, and they would then come to a ruling. But the big issue with this is that the ruling wasn't compulsory. Just like when Japan was brought before the League of Nations, the Court of Justice, was issued with moral condemnation, told that they should withdraw from Manchuria, and Japan said, no, we don't care about what you say. Okay, so it was a good thing, the Court of Justice, but its rulings were not compulsory, and it's worth pointing out that it didn't have the disposal of an army. It didn't have an army that it could just send into a country to sort out all of the problems. Okay, so the Court of Justice, I would argue, also caused problems for the League of Nations, not throughout just the 1920s, but also into the 1930s with the Manchurian and Abyssinian crisis. Okay. Now remember, the USA was not a member. If the USA was a member, would economic sanctions have more of an impact? Bearing in mind how big a country the USA is and what an important trading partner it is for many countries. Think about Japan. Yes, Ethan, I haven't got the chat bar up, so I missed your question there, or more of your statement. But you're absolutely right. Many countries relied upon the USA for trade, and when they weren't a member of the League of Nations, that meant economic sanctions were only going to have so much of an impact. Like, let's take, again, Japan for an example. The Japanese's main trading partner was the US, not Europe. So when European nations and other nations of the League of Nations said, hey, look, we might not trade with you, well, Japan didn't care less because they could carry on trading with the USA. So economic sanctions were only going to be successful through a process of collective security, and the fact that the USA was not part of this collective security definitely caused problems for the League later on. So let me go back to the textbook page. There we go. So let's continue with the League now. The Secretariat. Now, I'm going to give you some advice. There's no reason to revise this. The Secretariat is the branch of the League of Nations. It's like the administrative branch. So any course of action that the League decides upon, this branch puts it into action. Okay, if it means that we have to fine a country, this branch will deal with that. If it means a country needs to reduce the number of weapons it has or the size of its army, it's this branch that will deal with it. So anything that these guys decide, these guys put into action. And lastly, this bit down here is important to some degree because it's important that you remember that the League was not just invented to stop wars. It was created to create a better world. And here are some of the other commissions for the League of Nations. And you notice that they're not about war at all. There's a labour organisation, a disarmament commission, that's to do with war. There's a health organisation, a slavery commission, a commission for refugees, and a central opium board. It's interesting. But again, these things, if followed through and supported, would help to make the world a much safer place. So, there's some argument there that the way that the League was set up impacted its ability to do its job in the future. I'd be revising this. Let's continue. I'm not going to dwell upon this bit, but it is something that you might want to have a look at. I wouldn't spend ages revising it, especially for your mock, but it does talk about some of the successes that some of these different commissions had. Okay, there's nothing really here about war or stopping war other than when it talks about reducing the number of weapons that countries have. Okay, so we're not going to dwell on this, and it isn't something that I would encourage you to spend a lot of time revising. Here we go. The League's successes throughout the 1920s. Let's say they ask you a question not about, yeah, let's flip it on its head. We've been talking about the failures of the league up until this point. Let's imagine they ask you a question about the league's successes. Here is something that you might want to talk about amongst its failures as well. So let's whip through these really quickly. I'm not going to dwell on these too long because you have a detailed version of this in your exercise books. And if you don't, you do have access to this online textbook. Log on, the code is PX7, and you'll have access to it. So, 6 key events throughout the 1920s where the league was called into action. The first event is Vilna. Right? Hopefully you remember what Vilna was the capital of, what country it was the capital of. Lithuania. Okay? However, within the capital, there was a large number of Poles living, Polish people, and the Polish army invaded and took control of the city. Quite understandably, Lithuania, member of the League of Nations, appealed to the League for help. And the League said to Poland, "Oi, Poland, you better leave or else." And Poland said, "Or else what?" They called the League's bluff and did not leave Vilna. And as a result, the League was off to a bad start. Okay, it failed in Vilna. The next big event that the League was called in to deal with in the 1920s was an argument over Upper Silesia. Now, Poland was involved again alongside Germany. Okay? And they were both arguing over who controlled this region. The League came in. Actually, there was a plebiscite that was organised first. And a plebiscite is a vote in which, says it there, in which a whole country takes part. Okay? And Germany won 60% of the votes. Okay? So, according to the plebiscite, Germany should have got Upper Silesia, but Poland said the vote was unfair. Okay? They actually said that most of the people who voted for Germany no longer lived in Upper Silesia, so they shouldn't have had a say. And this is when Poland complained to the League of Nations and say, "Hey, look, it's unfair. Germany shouldn't be allowed to take all of Upper Silesia." The League came in, it investigated, and it ruled in favour of both of them, actually. Poland was to get part of Upper Silesia, and Germany was to get another part. Okay? Germany wasn't really satisfied with this because they'd lost 3/4, it says it down there. They ended up losing 3/4 of their coal mines to this new settlement. But you could argue that the League was successful during this period. It had stopped a potential war between Poland and Germany. Neither side were particularly happy, but there was no war. The League was successful. Moving on. The Åland Islands. Without looking, do you know who was arguing over them? Sweden and... You don't need to write it because I can't see the chat bar. But Sweden and Finland were arguing over the Åland Islands. They both had a claim to them. The League of Nations saw that it might end up in a war. It might escalate to a potential war. So they hopped on in to see what they could do about it. They investigated and they found in favour of Finland. Okay, Finland could have the Åland Islands, according to the League of Nations investigations, but, it's a big but, they were not to build military forts, okay, military bases that could be used to attack Sweden in the future. So once again, the League had successfully avoided a potential war. We don't know if there was going to be a war, but potentially there might have been. And the League was able to solve that dispute. Moving on. Right, Corfu. Corfu is a tricky one. If I zoom in first, I'm just clicking randomly on things. There we go. If I bring that up. Highlighter. Right, Corfu is a difficult one, and it is one that I would probably encourage you to forget. Okay. you will probably not end up having to write about the League of Nations involvement in Corfu. Okay, so we're going to leave that one alone. It's like a whole mini topic within itself. There's a lot that happened. There are lots of names. And if you're not going to really need it in the future, it doesn't seem sensible that we do any work on it. So let's move over to Bulgaria now. I quite like the cartoon above it. Scroll down. There we go. See the League of Nations represented by a dove. It's like a war dove, isn't it? It's like swooping into battle, ready to kill everybody. And who are the two sides arguing? You've got Bulgaria and Greece. It's kind of interesting that Bulgaria is carrying an umbrella. Is that to signify Bulgaria's weakness in comparison to Greece? Potentially, that Greece was the more dominant party in this war. But in comes the League of Nations swooping in to save the day. This could be taking the mick out of the League of Nations, but it could also be supporting them. Saying, hey, look, they're strong, they can stop wars. There's some humour attached to this. Right, let's scroll down. So, what happened? Greek soldiers were killed on the Bulgarian border. So, understandably, Greece was slightly annoyed and they invaded Bulgaria. Now, Bulgaria is a weak country in comparison to Greece. So, Greece had an easy job on their hands. And Bulgaria, being a member of the League of Nations, appealed for help. And Greece said, or rather the League of Nations said, okay, right, yes, Greece, you're in the wrong. You have invaded this weaker country, another member of the League of Nations, and you need to leave. So basically, the League morally condemned Greece, and they ordered them to withdraw. Okay. Now, Greece could not afford to get on the wrong side of the League. If the League ended up imposing economic sanctions on Greece, that could have crippled them. So in the wake of the kind of threats coming from the League of Nations, Greece was left with no choice but to withdraw from Bulgaria. Now, Greece felt this was somewhat hypocritical of the League because when Corfu was invaded by the Italians, the League didn't really do much to help. In some ways, they kind of supported Mussolini. But now Greece has invaded another country, Bulgaria. Here comes the League on their high horse saying, no, that's wrong, you shouldn't be doing that, and you must withdraw. And Greece, being a much weaker country than the Italians, had no choice. So this is a success for the League. We had a failure with Vilna, then a success in Upper Silesia, a success with the Åland Islands, success in Bulgaria, and now another failure when we consider the Wall Street crash. Okay, 1929, we're going to look at this in a bit more detail in a moment. There's a devastating depression that would last throughout the 1930s. Okay, something really, really bad. Countries suffered all over the world. One second, I just need to make a note. It's something I need to ask Mrs. Green tomorrow. Okay. So there was an economic depression brought on by the Wall Street crash in America in 1929. Now, the League tried, but was utterly useless in solving the crises that followed, the economic crises that affected so many countries and their governments. It meant that normal people started to turn their back on the traditional governments and start to look towards the extremists. Mussolini and the Hitler's parties, political parties, do very, very well when their countries are suffering. Because Mussolini, Hitler, those dictators, they appeal to people's fears. They say, hey, look, vote for us and we will solve all these problems. All of these problems have been caused by from a German point of view, from the Treaty of Versailles and foreign nations. That's what Hitler said. Vote for me, I will destroy the treaty and I will make Germany proud again. And people thought, well, look, could things get any worse? Could life get any worse? So we do vote for this man. And most of them thought no, because they were suffering so very much. So Hitler's popularity increases massively whenever there are problems within that country. And from 1929 onwards, that was the economic problems brought about by the Wall Street crash, and the League of Nations was unable to solve those problems, paving the way for the dictators. So we've got some failures and a few successes throughout the 1920s, stuff that you should know. I'm not saying it's definitely going to be on your exam, but you should revise it. Now, let's have another look at something which caused the League to fail in the 1920s, but also in the 1930s. If you think that the League collapsed in the 1930s, it's when it failed completely after Abyssinia, it kind of just disappeared. What pushed the League towards that point in the 1930s? And there are lots of things that happened in the 1920s that did contribute to the League's collapse in the 1930s. Now, I say that because that is one of the favourite questions about what caused the League to fail in the 1930s. And you don't have to think about stuff that happened just in the 1930s. There were some things that happened in the 1920s that caused problems later on. Okay, so if you get a question that does ask you about the failures of the League in the 1930s, you can talk about stuff that happened in the 20s as long as you can talk about why that became a problem in the 1930s. Okay, so two things that happened in the 1920s that caused problems in the 1930s and in the 1920s. Okay, and there are two agreements that were actually really good for the world, but really bad for the League of Nations. And hopefully you can remember why. So the first agreement was the Locarno Treaty. The Locarno Treaties, actually, there was more than one. But this was, again, something which was very, very, very good for the world, but very bad for the League. So the Locarno Treaty focused on Germany and France. Okay? The French Foreign Minister invited the German Foreign Minister to meet to sign a treaty to help improve relations between the old enemies. Now, what a great thing that they did. That looks like they're focusing on rebuilding Europe, making Europe a safer place. Germany and France meeting to decide how they can improve relations. What a great thing. But, a big but, this was done behind the League's back. The League was not involved in the Locarno treaties at all. And what that did was, it gave any of the League's enemies ammunition to argue that the League wasn't necessary. Look what we are able to achieve without the League's involvement. Two old enemies can get together and they can sort out their differences without the League sticking its nose into other people's business. And there were plenty of countries that felt that the League did overstep its mark. It got involved in problems that it shouldn't have got involved in. So any of those enemies of the League could now use this as a way of belittling the League to get rid of it. And some of the things that they agreed, and this is important, Germany officially agreed to accept the borders created by the Versailles Treaty, to give up any claim they had on areas such as Alsace-Lorraine, and they also agreed to work together to try to settle disputes peacefully. What brilliant agreements, what brilliant stuff. These are two mortal enemies from World War I. It looked like they would never be able to make friends again, never be able to see eye to eye, yet here they are, off their own backs, meeting and agreeing upon all of these points. Which again, is brilliant for the world. It's going to make the world a safer place, but it's bad for the League. And that is in turn bad for the world as well, because the League's job is to keep the world safe. If we undermine the League to a point that it collapses, the world becomes a more dangerous place. Who is there then to look out for the world, to try to stop wars? There's nobody. So unfortunately, this undermined the authority of the League, and it is definitely one of the things that made people lose faith in it later on. Okay? So the Kellogg-Briand Pact next, okay? Sorry, bad line. 1928. This is where 65 countries all met in Paris and decided that they would not use war as a way of solving disputes. And again, this was independent of the League. Individual countries acted independently. The League was not involved in this agreement, which again makes it look like the League is not necessary. We're putting a lot of effort into the League, lots of money, lots of support. It's a bit of a pain in the backside. Is it really necessary when we can do these sorts of things without the League? And unfortunately, too many people saw it that way. From the 1920s, the League did, throughout the late 1920s, the League was put into positions where it seemed like it was losing authority over its members. And again, even members of the League felt that it might be unnecessary if we can achieve all of this stuff without the League's involvement. Okay, so moving on again. Something else that happened in the 1920s, and this is probably going to be our last thing, we'll take it up to Manchuria, and then we'll do that next week. Manchurian and Abyssinian crisis next week, that seems sensible. Now, I like the title of this page in the textbook, The Decline of International Cooperation. Now, what forced countries to stop cooperating with each other? Basically, the financial crash of 1929, the Wall Street crash in America. It didn't just hit Americans hard, it hit the world hard, because countries relied upon America for trade. If American businesses are closing down, people lose money. That means they don't want the luxury goods that are imported from Europe. That means European companies lose an important trading partner and they close down, make people unemployed. Unemployment skyrockets. So what happens in America happens around the world. So by 1933, we've got 15 million Americans unemployed. Many have lost their homes. They're starving. Life is miserable. On top of that, the American government starts to ask for the loans to be paid back. Germany got out of the hyperinflation crisis by borrowing huge amounts of money from the Americans. Now the Americans want that money back, and it plunges European countries back into economic depression. Germany had spent the whole of the 1920s trying to claw themselves out of the economic depression. And now, because of issues in America, they're plunged right back to square one. You can understand how Hitler capitalized on this. Hitler always said it was a bad idea borrowing money from America. Now it just looked like Hitler was like a guru, a fortune teller, somebody that could be trusted because he predicted that this was going to happen. Not an economic crash, but he said it was going to be bad borrowing money from America. And in turn, this pushed people towards those extremist leaders that were promising, excuse me, easy solutions to very difficult problems. People think, well, throughout the last 10 years, throughout the whole of the 1920s, things have been miserable. So let's give this Hitler guy a chance. So without a shadow of a doubt, this caused problems for the League of Nations. On top of this, and this is going back to the title now, members of the League were less likely to cooperate together because they had bigger problems within their own countries. So many countries were now suffering from economic depression that they were less likely to cooperate with each other to solve the world's problems. And this was absolutely true for the League of Nations after the Wall Street crash. Countries started to look inwards rather than outwards. They started to focus on their own problems rather than the world's problems. And in turn, that weakens the League. Once again, it makes it look like people do not believe in the League anymore because they're not supporting it, they're not being involved in it. And then lastly, the Wall Street crash removes one of the League's major weapons. It doesn't have an army, but what it does have is economic sanctions. where members of the League will gang up on a country and refuse to trade with it. Unfortunately, after the Wall Street crash, members of the League of Nations were less likely to support economic sanctions because, yes, it might hurt said country if we impose economic sanctions on Germany, for example, or even Japan, but in doing so, we hurt our own economies as well. And this was a period where we did not want our own economies suffering, because they're already suffering enough. So the League lost one of its major weapons, and this can be seen when we look at Japan invading Manchuria. The League didn't impose economic sanctions on Japan. The League imposed moral condemnation. Why didn't it go to the next level and impose economic sanctions? Because members of the League did not support it. They felt that it would hurt their economies too much. And as a result, I suppose you could argue that Japan was allowed to get away with the invasion of Manchuria. So this was a major event for the League of Nations and definitely contributed to its failure in the 1930s. And there we go, we're up to the Manchurian crisis now. And that seems like a sensible spot to leave it. So next lesson, next revision session, we'll look at the Manchurian crisis and the failure of the League of Nations there. We'll have a look at the Abyssinian crisis and the failure of the League of Nations there. And then we will try to put everything together to think about why the League failed in the 1930s. Was it just because the USA was not a member? Or was it because of a lot of other things that we've also spoken about? So let me go back to Teams. No questions, and you're all still here, which is excellent. So unless you've got any questions now, I will bid you farewell. Make sure, one last thing, make sure you're attending the lessons. I know there's only 4 or 5 of you here, but make sure you're attending every single lesson. I'm giving you not just revision lessons, but classroom lessons as well. I'm giving you so many tips on what to focus on within revision in the build up to your mock exam. So take care, everybody. Thank you for joining in. Bye, Angelina. See you soon. You too, Ethan. Take it easy, mate. Dom, take care. Lauren, look after yourselves, both of you. Yeah, take it easy, Harrison. See you soon, mate. Bye-bye. I'm going to leave now, everybody.